And
And I will turn it over to you, Scott. If you don't mind introducing yourself first and your
for
role at Plainfield Public Library. And I will
uh,
say one more thing as my opening that I have had the pleasure of working with Scott on various projects over the years. And Plainfield Public Library does an amazing job, has grown a lot of partnerships. And so when there was a question that came up a few months ago just about Title II and government funding and things like that, I automatically thought of Scott, who has a great perspective on that. So with that, Scott, take it away.
all right, let me just get my screen up here. And can everybody see the presentation?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Actually, I've got a little slide that explains a lot of that stuff. It's coming up just a little bit after this. So I'm going to ask you all to bear with me. Uh, okay. Sorry, it's doing a thing. Come on. Give me one sec. There we are. Okay. So let me just give you guys a couple of quick disclaimers. I like to set boundaries. Andrea is absolutely right. I'm big on questions. I really, really like that. It tells me you guys are engaged and it gives me a sense of where you want me to dig in more because this is a really big topic. So just the first thing, I am not your attorney. Okay, I'm going to tell you the thing that I say anytime anybody asks me to tell them whether they need an attorney is if you're asking an attorney whether you need an attorney, you know the answer to your question. Okay, so if it's something where you feel like we're entering that realm, talk to your board's counsel, talk to your guy who handles that. First off, you guys are from all over the country. I'm not licensed in your states. I don't know anything about you. So please, 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 if we get into anything that even smells legal, make sure that you want to talk to your whoever provides counsel for that, whether it's through the city or whether you have one for your board. Um, which kind of leads to the other point. There's a lot of smaller focus on stuff. And we're going to spend time talking about the different levels of government unit that you can be looking for partnerships and funding, right? And we're all going to sort of be operating under a federal umbrella, but then we're going to talk about all the other stuff. And as that breaks down, the smaller those units are, the more particularities there may be, like, how the organization works. Like, for example, some states don't have both a Department of Labor and a Department of Ed, and they're combined under that. Some states, their county funding situation is different. Some states, how they fund their libraries are different. So I'm going to try to avoid getting too much into minutia on that because I would not want to steer you incorrectly unless you're from New Jersey, and then you can hit me up later about stuff. Okay, so what are we going to cover specifically? I really want to spend the majority of this actually talking about why we want to be looking at government money specifically. Um, and that's because we're kind of talking about this in terms of changing the way that libraries operate and the way that libraries are perceived in terms of the public and their ability to access funding. And some of that is these are services that we know that there's a large public support to fund. And we know that there's a lot of funding out there for it, even at the government level. We know it's like, ooh, this is stuff the government has money for and they want to do. So it's a way for us to sort of pivot and to maintain our solvency in the face of, unfortunately, what are shrinking budgets, right? I don't like to say this because this is not the right audience for it, but we all sort of know that it is difficult at times when the public's perception is that a library is just the building with the books to go, but you guys should keep funding it. So these tend to be getting you engaged in stronger funding streams that also are, I think, in many ways easier to sell to continue to do that. So we're going to talk about how this affects libraries as a paradigm shift. We're going to talk about specifically how to both go after government money, but what to do to keep it, because I will be honest, we've been doing a lot of government contracts here for the last 14 years since I got here. I don't have to work that hard to get those contracts anymore because we did that work on the back end. Once you have sort of shown yourself as somebody they want to do business with, it actually stops being quite as hectic to get there. And just really, I do want to talk about how this may have to change the way you operate within your building a little bit, but also how it changes the public perception of your building. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm going very fast because I want to make sure I leave enough time for questions. Um, okay, so we're not going to go too in-depth into regulatory talk. We are going to mention WIOA because we can't talk about funding without WIOA, but we're not going line and verse on it. I'm going to avoid specifics to your region, and there's just a detail of day-to-day operation of a funded program or how to run a funded program that we're probably not going to get into, but absolutely call me. Here's my contact information. We've spent a lot of time over the years through various projects trying to help other programs launch or grow or pivot, and it actually brings me quite a sense of joy. I think that we're sort of moving what libraries do in a really positive direction. So I like being a part of that. So please do not feel like you're ever bothering me. Okay, so a little about us, and I find that telling this story explains the perspective where we're coming from and how we got here. So before I came into library world, I was a high school English teacher, and I ended up then working in adult and under a workforce learning link. And so this was a county funded program. And I got a lot of experience in how a county funded program works. So when I got this job to run their literacy department, I sort of intentionally said, I want to run this in a way that will be compliant with all of the requirements to receive WIOA funding. Because if we're going to have to go out and get money, we should already be doing it, right? And that is a thing that's going to carry through all of this. So we're going to refer back to WIOA a lot. That's the Workforce Investment Opportunity Act. It used to be just which was covers all of the federal funding that essentially comes directly for workforce funding. But this idea that we need to design and maintain our services so that they're always compliant or as close to compliant with the highest level of funding that you're going after, as opposed to adjusting based on that, right? Like you're never going to be, oh, I'm doing something that's going to be compliant for the highest level of funding. And then we get something from like maybe a funding stream that has less requirements. They're not going to be different. It's going to be less. So it never hurts to you to maintain that. And it's very, very bad data and very bad programming to be trying to adjust on the fly to switch things around. So in a single year, we'll go through, like right now, I have state funding, I have, which is technically under workforce development, WDP funds, which is a New Jersey thing. I have workforce learning link funds. I have a whole bunch of different streams. And I operate the whole program, though, at one particular level. So anyway, we came in and we did that. And then the first big grant we got was something called Literacy for Jersey, which was through the Department of Labor at the state level. But this was actually a WIOA Title II program, okay? And we actually did such a good job with this that the Commissioner of Labor sort of said, hey, maybe we want to look at doing libraries, and we want to bring libraries in as a vendor, and you do have to think yourself as a vendor for these services. And from there, we've seen the Department of Labor kind of through a whole bunch of different iterations of grants focus specifically on providing funding for workforce programming in library world. So we've been really happy about that. And in between that, we then started getting workforce learning link contracts through our county WIB. From there, I think this was before Andrea's time, we worked with New Jersey State Library to do a series of literacy boot camps, which was basically, saying we've been able to continually get positions funded via attaching ourselves to workforce. How can we help other libraries do that? And we did those in 2015 and 2017. Then we got different workforce learning link contracts again. We did a program. It was IMLS and New Jersey State Library funded, and we worked with Andrea on this. The what is it? Labor and Literacy Labs, which is under the Literacy Partners Program. It was a lot of different names, but essentially, to us, it was a bit of a reboot of the Literacy Bootcamp, but with a shift more to digital literacy services from other services. And we've been able to keep that going and essentially providing support to libraries that are looking to enter into this. I think the biggest focus that we've seen, and I think this is something I even heard little bits of while people were talking about what they're doing, is getting over that initial hill of the momentum of programming. Like when you're a singular librarian or you have like 5 hours a week to put towards this sort of programming, how do you operate it in such a way that you can get funding? And without that funding, how do you get the staffing to do it? So I think that's what we've been hearing is the most difficult thing is getting the human capital and the resource capital to be able to engage in these services in a way that would be required to attach yourself to the more stringent funding streams that we see. Okay. Woo! Let's get into the nitty gritty. There's a couple of different services that we provide under this. We do a lot of ESL. We do GED, or sorry, high school equivalency prep. We're also a GED testing center. We do a lot of digital literacy. And when I say digital literacy, I want to be very specific because this is the thing you'll see with a lot of the programs. To be funded, we can't just go, oh, we do digital literacy. We have to attach it to benchmarking. So we use a couple of different ranges of certificates. We do something called North Star, which I'm sure everybody here knows about. We do IC3 and we do Microsoft Office certs. One of the things that I'm really happy we've been able to do through our connection to the state is we got them to accept North Star and IC3 as basically valid benchmarks under the funding we've received. They piloted it with us and then they expanded that out to the state. So that was really cool. And of course, standard job search assistance stuff. It says we're going to revisit this later because when we talk about what happens when you take government funding, I want to talk about how when you take that money, it affects what it is you do. And this is certainly one of the things that I've seen people in the library world struggle with a little bit because I think we have a aspirational view of our services. And I don't think it's a bad thing that one, they should always be free, which is what's the good thing about government funding. Two, they should be open to everybody. We should do everything in our power to not deny anyone service of any sort. We should be getting them what they need. We should be as barrier free as possible. And unfortunately, sometimes those aspirational goals meet the wall of practical reality. And that is sometimes very difficult and having to balance those things. Okay, so why funding? I know this sounds stupid, but what we really do want to talk about is not all money is the same, right? And we all know this, right? Like you have your municipal budget, you have your other budgets. Some budget can be used on staffing, some can't. We have to figure how stable is the source of funding because we don't want to open programming that we don't think we're going to be able to maintain, which is why a lot of times one-time donations are kind of weird. But I also want to talk about the way that we can use one source of funding to catapult into other sources of funding. So what do I mean? So for example, we've been really fortunate to be able to use the funding that we've gotten through various streams to build our program. And actually, and this is a thing that I understand in the library world, I'm going to say this, you can go, no, it's a legend. That's like a Yeti. They don't really exist. We've gotten our budget increased by the city because what we were able to do was take federal money or state money and run these programs that were putting up really good numbers in terms of what you consider economic development and job development. And we were looking at sort of some lapses and stuff, and we were able to go to the city and go, listen, you guys have money you're going to use to fund this sort of service. We're already doing it and we're doing it well. And so we've multiple times gotten positions added. When I came in, it was me. I had one full-time person under me. I've got 4 full-time people under me, and we have about 20 grant-funded employees now. So, when we came off of our first big state grant, where we've been functioning as a workforce learning link, we were looking at a gap again. Our local American Job Center had really liked being able to send us clients while they were waiting for them to move into ITA-funded programming. And we were like, hey, you're not going to be able to still do that because I don't have the money for staffing. And I sort of remember very clearly the head of the AJC, Gene Kozolinsky, not that that name matters to you guys, goes, well, how much do you need? And I said, about $50,000. And he goes, magically, that's the exact amount I have left in my budget. So we did our first county contract with them. Because if you're doing good service that people don't want to see go away, you're going to find that there are ways to use one source to create a momentum, right? So we want to move from being able to pilot to get things to stable funding. We've gotten computer labs built for us by the city now because they love being able to send for our digital literacy stuff. The state kicked in on things. Uh, so there's hope, and you can build is kind of what I'm going for, not to sit and, I don't want anything to sound like I'm bragging, but just to say that you can start at one level and roll success in providing this service into uh, getting resources from other places as well. And ultimately, what this is going to do is help you redefine, the library for the public, because even if we're not talking about expanding your budget, everybody here has been in this position where they've been trying to cut your budget, right? And we all know, what do they do what do you do if you're trying to cut your budget? You get the people to come out to those city council meetings. And so when they can come out with those stories of like, they helped me get a job, they helped me get my GED, the more people you're touching with more meaningful service, they're going to be more willing to come out and fight for you to keep your budget. And we've definitely had this programming lead to us being able to successfully fight budget cuts too. So there's a lot that's really, really important about this. Okay, types of funding, the pros and cons of each individual type of funding. Obviously, we always want to be on municipal budget if we can, right? Because that's going to be the most stable. It's going to be a position that you're not going to have problems getting into full time, because that is something that's problematic. Like, we find if it's a grant funded position, we can't always get benefits for them, right? So we're all of a sudden hiring part-time, and we're hiring part-time people who know that they may not have a job in a year. And that definitely affects our ability to attract necessarily the sort of staff that we want. I've been very lucky that I have fantastic staffing, but when you have a municipal position where it's then somebody who's full-time and somebody who can be offered benefits, you're going to definitely have more stability in that, because I've had people where I've had part-timers who are fantastic, but if they're that great and they're like taking a part-time gig with you, it's because they're looking for something else. And I don't fault them for it, but that's the truth of it. So we always want to be in municipal budget if we can. Donations and fundraising, that's great, but you are very rarely going to be getting that on a scale or with the sort of regularity you need to use it for programming, right? You hit a level where you're interacting with sort of small private grants, whatever. Look, if you need a computer, they're great. If there's a slight shortfall in one area of your book budget, they're great. But they don't have the stability that's required to do actual programming. The one thing they do have that's absolutely fantastic is they're liquid, right? Because when we're dealing with funds from most of these other things, there's going to be rules about what you can use it for and what you can't use it for. So you'll end up in these weird positions where you're like, I have $500,000, but I can't, buy snacks for this event. And that has absolutely happened to us. So there are absolutely reasons you want to have some donation and some fundraising, but it's not a sustainable model. Private, charitable, and corporate giving tends to be the same thing. One, corporations want to be able to put their name on something. You might be able to go out and get somebody who's going to get you a lab, but they're not going to necessarily give you money on a long-term basis that you'd be using to fund a position. The other thing is there's been a big turn at larger corporations, and some of them even issued specific statements on this, like Verizon here has, that they want to fund systems as opposed to local stuff. So maybe if you were a county system, or maybe if you're part of a consortium, but an individual building, the corporations who are large enough to be making a sizable donation, or a donation that's going to fund programming, they're not going to look at somebody of your size is one of the things. Really what you have to hope for is that there's some like rich person who grew up at your library that's feeling very charitable or dies, and that's not a great plan, right? you can have some trust, but if you want to have a self-perpetuating trust for even a position, let's say you assume, a gain of, 4 to 6% a year, like if you're just playing your indexes, you're talking like $1 million to be able to sort of pull off your earnings from it to even fund like a position without depleting the principal of your trust. So it's just, not like super wonderful. Government grants and contracts, why do I like them? And we do a lot of them. There's clarity, right? Um, Anybody can access them, or anybody who's qualified can access them. They have to post them. If anybody here has read, a standard notice of grant opportunity from any government entity, they tell you exactly what you need to do. They're graded by rubrics. There's clarity. You know what it is you need to produce. You know how the funding needs to go. A lot of times they're part of programs where you're going to have a sense of whether there's going to be continuity to not. It's going to get you connected into the larger system, right? And I mentioned like 3 or 4 different funding streams we've jumped between, and I wouldn't have been able to move from one stream to the other if I hadn't had to interact with, let's say, our county workforce development board as a condition of our state money. And then when the workforce development board had money, they already knew me. So it's going to get you connected with that. You're going to get connected with the other players in your system as well. Some of the issues, even if you're dealing with government funding at a smaller level, say you're dealing with county level, you are still at the mercy of whatever forces are going on at a larger level. What do I mean by that? Every time there's a threat of a government shutdown, even though it's federal, that almost always rolls downward in impacting the availability of funds, because even if you're dealing with county money, even if you're dealing with state money, there's a good chance that one threat of that leads back to the feds. So whenever there's a threat of it, basically that'll kick back timelines on reissuance of stuff. Like, for example, one of the grants that we get from the New Jersey Department of Labor that is not technically federal, we won't know when the new year of the issuance comes out. And we have had periods where, we've had to talk about, are we furloughing staff? Are we not? Where it's not a question of will we get the money again? It's a question of when will we get the money again? And that question, there's nothing you can do about it. It doesn't matter how much of a pest you are. It doesn't matter how many times you call to remind them, because it's so many levels above the people that you're probably directly dealing with. So it's, not all candy and roses. Okay, I get asked this all the time. What about 501c3s? I'm going to keep this like really short unless there's somebody here who absolutely needs to know. Please stop. It's not that important. There's IRS doctrine books on this. You're a government entity. You're tax exempt. Stop it. In fact, as a government entity, you're going to open way more doors than you will as that. The first time we took a government contract, we had to be on something called the ETPL, which is the eligible training providers list. We'll talk about that under WIOA. And I think we were the only public library on it for a long time in the state. And people would be like, oh my God, how did you do that? And I said, I called up the school approval unit and I said, can we get on the list? And they said, you're a library? I said, yeah. They said, you're government? I said, yeah. They said, cool. And that was it. Okay, so don't worry about it. You can take donations, at least in New Jersey, you definitely can. You're tax exempt. You can write your tax exempt letters. You're not involved in regulation, so there's no reason you can't take a donation. You don't want to be a 501c3. The only government entities that want to be a 501c3 are ones that operate in some way like a business. So that would be your colleges and universities, public hospitals, where they have a lot of money coming in a semi-commercial kind of setting. Most times when you're looking to access funding that may say it requires a 501c3, most of the time, you know what I find? You can just call them up and be like, hey, we're also tax exempt. And it's like, oh yeah, cool. When we said 501c3, that's what we meant. It is very, very rare that I'll find somebody who has a only 501c3 and we really mean it to be that and not just tax exempt. You're a public library. Throw that weight around. People like us. You don't need it. Okay? I get it every time I talk about funding. Don't worry about it. Okay. So yeah, government funding, it's stable or more stable. It's more clear. what you need to do to get it, what you need to do to maintain it. It's accessible. It's not necessarily based on, I had this experience. I have a bunch of friends who their job is, as they describe it, helping rich people keep all of their money. Uh, they're very depressed about that. Not so depressed that they give it up and go be school teachers, but they, more that it just turns them into alcoholics. But the point is, so they deal with a lot of money, and I was out with some of them one night, and I just happened to mention that we needed like $5,000 for something. I was like talking about writing a grant for it, and one of the other investment guys was like, "Oh, yeah, I got you." So there is a thing where some of the other forms of funding you're looking for requires access that you don't have. And like, frankly, that was a weird one-off. So they're going to have to post it publicly, right? So it's accessible. It doesn't depend on connections. The other thing is the fact that you are also government is really, really helpful in applying for it, okay? Because we're all on the same team. And as I said, most importantly, once you're engaged in some levels of government funding, you get engaged with all of the key players at your local levels of funding and service provision as well. Okay, so why not government funding? And this is why people push back sometimes when we talk about it. When people give you money, they want to know what you did with it. It's just shocking. This comes as a surprise to a lot of people, but it's true. And generally, you're going to have a lot of record keeping to do. Now, I've always been surprised that the library world does not love this, because I would think librarians would be really keen on record keeping, but this has been a source of a lot of pushback. I will say often some of the records that they ask you to maintain may make you or your clients uncomfortable. For example, today we just got audited, because that's going to happen if you take government money. We got audited by the county. And some of our clients do pass through some WIOA funded programming. And so like we had to show that we still had our records that had their social security numbers, driver's licenses, birth certificates, all of that good stuff. I don't love that. I'm going to be honest with you. I do not love that. I wish we didn't have to do it. But my answer to why we should get comfortable with it is, one, your libraries, you already know how to keep stuff confidential. You take tons of information from people's library cards. Two, if you're not doing it, somebody else is doing it. And I trust libraries to do it more than I trust some random 501c3 that opened up shop and decided to take a government contract. Okay. Three, the clients don't mind. As long as the service that you are providing is commensurate with what you're asking. So like, hey, if, it was like coming to a library arts and crafts night and you're like, can I see your social security number? Yeah, they'd be like, hey, what? But when you're talking about they're applying for a longer form of service, and that is what's going to happen if you're doing the government funding on this, because you have to get them out to a benchmark. Hey, you're signing up to take an 8-week digital literacy course with us that's going to get you an industry recognized credential, and it's free, and we're government. Nobody questions why you're asking them for documentation, because they're used to that. They go to a government place to get help with something. They're used to having to produce documentation. Now, this does mean that there are some clients that we have some difficulty with serving. And I want to put that question all the way to the end, because I guarantee if cameras were on, people would be giving me that look. We're going to talk about it. Okay, and there are ways around it, and we're pretty good at it. But there are going to be some limits to that. It's just going to give you less control over the types of programming you want to do. For example, something we've pushed back on is all of our programs, because our funding comes through labor, really does have to be somewhat job focused. Like, I would love to be offering more programming that was targeting our senior population, like how to use a smartphone, that kind of stuff. But one, unless it's for people who are actively seeking work, I can't do it out of my Department of Labor money. And it's just not going to be a recognized benchmark. We were finally successful in getting ESL as a funded program. If anybody's tried to do that, there's really almost no federal benchmarking for that, for your outcomes. You can use NRS levels, but what's that outcome going to be? And we also have to do much larger scale programming. I think that's a big change from the way that libraries usually do that. We like to be more like one-off, more, hey, come for this slightly less intensive program. It's an introduction to something. It's a one-day thing. And if you're going to be taking real program money, it's going to be certainly much longer scale goals. So, oops, that's the slide I want to go to. So, for example, ESL, now that it will be funded, we have to get them to show a single NRS level improvement. That's not happening in 6 weeks. You're not even supposed to test them without 6 months of service between. If we're talking about GED, our outcomes, and these are all WIOA-backed outcomes, are attain high school diploma or go up one GLE, that's a grade level equivalency, and enroll in a secondary training. Digital literacy, we have to get them what's considered an industry recognized credential. So those are your Microsoft certs, those are all those. These are long-term goals, so you do have to be providing significantly larger services. And it does occasionally get difficult to provide service at the same level for clients who do not either meet requirements to do that or don't need such intensive servicing, right? That can be absolutely very difficult. So federal funding in more detail. You guys probably are not going to get direct federal funding unless you're a really, really, really large system. You're more likely to have federal funding passed to you through a smaller entity, be it the state to the county to you, be it, we've had federal through Department of Labor at the state level, or like IMLS has done funding through stuff, but I don't really want to talk about that because IMLS is its own other thing and not necessarily workforce, of course. It's probably not coming to you directly, but why do you need to know about it? Because if the money touches federal labor, it's probably going to have some WIOA attachment to it, which the Workforce Innovations Opportunities Act, I've mentioned it like 8 million times, which has various titles under it as far as what are the things that it can fund, which, displaced homemakers, adults, youth. There's been a lot of changes to the funding formula at the federal level. I got to tell you, they've been shifting something like, I think it's like 70% of funding is supposed to go to in-school youth or out-of-school youth now. But the big stuff that you need to worry about is if you are dealing with either directly WIOA funded stuff or you're working under a program that is WIOA, your clients will have to be WIOA certified. And that's where we run into a lot of the paperwork stuff, because that has to show employment eligibility, which if you look at your I-9 form, that'll give you that list, but it's a lot of documentation. There was some new federal guidance issued where they're stepping back, having to do that for first line service, but there was guidance, but not application issued on it. And we have an administration change. And, however everybody voted, which I'm sure I can't guess in a room full of librarians, it is an administration that I don't think is going to be particularly lenient when it comes to questions of how much documentation somebody has. And we're going to see that as a ripple effect through how that federal funding is applied, because we definitely saw rollbacks on that when this administration was in last time, and it was generally not good for us as a program and stuff. To be able to access those WIOA funds, you have to be on something called the eligible training providers list. I mentioned it before, but what's cool is in the last reauthorization of WIOA, our senator or our representative, Rush Holt, from our district specifically, got language included that specifically calls out libraries in it. And your state can apply for an ETPL waiver. And that waiver, what it does is means that certain categories of vendor, which includes you guys, does not have to meet all of the record keeping and record production requirements. And the logic behind that is you have, like your career schools, like your CDL schools, and these are private entities that are doing that. And what the school evaluation units do is make sure that essentially if I'm spending workforce dollars, it's not a scam. But since, things like libraries and the publicly, the other public options like this, we're not making any money, we don't really need that level of scrutiny. So that's been pretty cool. I'm going to move much faster because I just saw what time it got to, and I think I'd rather you guys ask me questions about things you want to know more about. But yeah, the big deal is if you are taking government funding, knowing where that stream is coming from is going to affect the way that you design your records, both from the amount of service you do, the benchmarks you get to, and sometimes what level of client that you're going to be able to serve. All right. I just want to hit this list, and we probably could have spent the whole time on it, but this is how to get money and how to keep money. Um, First, know your place. And when I say that, um, you have a system, and what you want to do is find where in the system you can best provide service. There's a reason we don't do one-room schoolhouses anymore. That's a terrible way to provide service. So for us, we've had wonderful relationships with our county college, essentially targeting clients who are not yet ready to go to county college, right? But instead of competing with the county college, the county college sends to us when somebody tabs with them and comes in too low. We send to people when they complete with us. We just entered into a consortium with them now that we're going to get $150,000 from the state. We just found out about that a couple of days ago over the next 2 years, working with the county college. So we found where we work so that we're not competing with anybody, but we're supporting them. And that also means when they have stuff, they're going to be willing to work with us too. So be specific in who you're targeting and where that's a gap in your system. Okay. Uh, there's room to grow. I was mentioning, we went from 2 employees to 4 full-time and 20 grant funded. Figure out a scope that works for you. But, and I mean this very specifically, do not sacrifice what makes libraries libraries. I've seen people try to attach to funding where they turn themselves into a funnel, and it's not good. Oh, we're going to just do the subscription for this online class. Well, what does that have to do with libraries? You're not forwarding the cause of why libraries are unique. You're not forwarding the cause of why libraries can provide this service well. At some point, they're just going to go, or I could just fund this, the county could just, or the state could just contract with that provider themselves. Or, well, we're going to bring in people from whatever, this organization or this county college, and they're just going to teach the class on our site. Okay, so then how are you different than like a VFW hall, right? So we really, really, really want to make sure that we're engaging in this as how is it that libraries, or why are libraries the best agency to provide this? Set expectations. A lot of these are just about doing business. Do not promise things you can't do. Be clear up front with people what's going on. Communication is always the key. I always tell everybody when I was a high school teacher, I failed more people than all the people in my department put together every year. I never, and this is true, never had one problem with any parent ever because the kid didn't fail my class overnight. I was on the phone with mom, from week 2 on. You know, if you are not upfront with the people you're doing business with, they will figure it out eventually, and then you stop being somebody they do business with. So, you want to, one of the professors in law school always used to say, a client who always wants you to say yes to them is not a client you want either, right? You want somebody who's going to listen when you're like, well. So that's why no but is often better than yes and. We can't do this because this, but here's how we can work with you, right? And that but is really important. You want to, when you run into a problem, be able to communicate what that solution is going to be. Nobody wants to go, no, I can't do it. Nope. They don't want to work with you. Go, I can't do that, but I can do this. That will work with you. Be where the action is. So like tomorrow, I'm going to the Workforce Development Board meeting, and Monday I have to go to the AJC operators meeting, and I go to a lot of meetings, but frankly, that's where things get done. And it's not even the meeting, it's the 10 minutes before the meeting and the 10 minutes after the meeting where everybody's sitting around going, hey, I have some funds left for youth stuff. Can you put together a GED program for the summer? That happened this summer. Yeah, we can do that. If you're not engaging with the system and not going to those meetings, like you can't just sit around and expect people to give you money. That doesn't happen. And also, they know you and they know your face. So then when money comes up, they go, hey, I wonder if they can do something with this, because you know when the money is going to come up, by the way, it's always going to be like 3 months before the close of the year, if they're on whichever fiscal they're on, whether on the June fiscal or the December fiscal, because no one wants to end with money in their budget. And they're going to go, I need to burn this money. Sorry, they won't say it. I need to spend this money wisely and efficiently. You want to be the person they think of for that. Always operate at the highest standard. That's not just the platitude of, hey, they do a good job. It's what I was talking about. Do not be in a position where you're constantly changing your operations or scaling down your data protocols or scaling down your services because, oh, well, we're not currently under WIOA, so we don't have to do this. It just leads to incredibly sloppy record keeping, or leads to incredibly sloppy service, because you guys are data people, or you should all be to a certain extent. If your metrics are not consistent, if your systems aren't consistent, they can't all talk to each other. You want to build your system in a way that you don't have to change it, no matter who it is who's giving the money. Have your elevator pitch. I have my elevator pitch. Why libraries? Well, because we're government, so you know us, you trust us. There's a lot of stuff we don't have to do. The every dollar you give us goes directly to client service, as opposed to a 501c3, where even if you have the smallest 501c3 two-man mom and pop shop, they're 100K in the hole before they're providing service to anyone, right? There's a whole lot of reasons you want to be working with the library. People like going to the library. You know what makes libraries amazing? When people are like, oh, you work in a library? It is the one building that everyone knows. It's a government building that somebody can just walk into and say, I need help. That's awesome, isn't it? So have your pitch. Return on investment. This is big. This is another paradigm shift I find for library people. The key to getting this money is not convincing people of your cause. They already know. They already know that. Listen, nobody goes, I have $1 million to give to end childhood hunger. You don't have to convince them that childhood hunger is bad. You have to convince them that you will do the most to end childhood hunger. You have to talk return on investment. I think in library world, we like to sort of be like, libraries are a good, they're just good. And don't we like reading? You got to get into the numbers. You got to explain why you can do it more efficiently. And you can, by the way, because your lights are on and the walls are already there. You already have computers. Okay, you can do it, but you got to talk in that way as opposed to aspirationally. Get used to grant writing being terrible writing. This is really hard, but you have to get used to it. Remember, they're graded by rubric, particularly the government ones, and that's as a matter of transparency. So you need to literally restate every single question you're going to answer so that you can go through and check it off, no matter how redundant it is. If anyone is really bored, I will send you the grant I had to write for us to get a new roof, which we got, I think, $500,000 for. And there were questions like, how will this money be used to support technology? And I had to write, this money will be used to support technology because with no roof, it will rain on the computers and they will go boom. Like stuff like that. And I would literally have to just write, no roof is bad, no roof is bad 48 times. We got the grant though, just saying, you have to get used to that. Brag and back it up. You should know, like off the top of your head, how many outcomes did you have last year? You know, we had 15 GED grads, we had 26 new citizens, we had I want to say 260 digital literacy certs, we had active, you know, you need to know that stuff. I also want to talk about what we might call puffery. And I don't know if anybody here is familiar with that term from contracts, which is there is a way to describe stuff with a positive spin that is perfectly acceptable, but if you go too far, then it's just lying. And so knowing where that balance is really, really, really important. And I'm going to tell you this, don't lie. It will always, always, always catch up with you, particularly if you're dealing with government stuff, because everything is documented. Like I said, we just got done getting audited. Never, ever, it's never worth it. It is never worth it. In fact, I'm going to tell you guys a really cool story. One of the reasons we got more money from the state one year was when the commissioner of labor came down to inspect our site. I had done something. We had a retention rate of something like about 60%, which for adult ed is pretty normal. And we didn't hide that. But what we had done was we called or made a note next to every single drop of like, oh, this person phone was disconnected, this person medical issue, this person got a job, this person moved. And so we were able to go, hey, you know, we had 40% drop. This is what we found was one of the bigger problems. Transportation was a key issue. And by being direct and showing that we knew that stuff, he left going, oh my God, these guys are great, right? People are pretty good at smelling puffery. You know, people are pretty good at sniffing that out. So being direct is basically the way to go. And again, if these aren't people that are going to respect your being direct, you don't want to be in business with them anyway. Finally, I shouldn't have to say this, but be professional. Be professional. It is time to do business. I still remember, I'm not going to name names, and there's nobody here who was there except maybe Andrea. We had a meeting with some people who were getting money through one of our programs. There was a lot of people. Somebody showed up having ridden their bike there in biking gear. Not motorcycle, by the way, like Tour de France style gear. I don't want to give you more money, you know? So please, be businesslike and ask, there's a story I quote all the time about this guy. He found out he had cancer, and it's very, chicken soup for the soul thing. But I like this one. He said, I just stopped being afraid to ask for stuff. I was on a flight with my kid and he wanted to see the cockpit. And I just asked and they let him. So even with us, where we've been able to, as I said, we had a problem that we were getting clients who were coming in at significantly lower levels of digital literacy than we felt we could adequately service. And so we went back to our contact at the state and we said, Danielle, can I switch the certs we're using? It's still an outcome, but these guys can't handle it. And we got that cert in place. And then they shipped that out to, that's now something that can be used at the state. We said, we don't want to tabe our digital literacy people. It doesn't make sense. Can we use this test instead? And then they accepted it. And now it's being in use because we knew what we needed to get the job done. We were able to present it that way, and they let us pilot stuff. Ask professionally, but do it. The amount of times I've just asked people for money with a plan and we've gotten it, you'd be shocked, but you got to go out and make that happen. All right. It is 3. I have talked for 45 minutes straight. I am so sorry. I'm sure you all have stuff to do, but is it cool if I stay on for people to ask me questions? I don't know if that's something that's all right.
Sure. And we did have a question in the chat that I just wanted to make sure that you could answer. How many adult learners do you serve each year? And can you also share how many people live in Plainfield?
Sure. Plainfield has roughly 55,000 people, but that's not a good number to use when we talk about our service. And maybe I should mention this. Generally, the level of government unit that you're taking the funding from is going to be the scope of service you have to do. So, for example, our state funding, I can't deny somebody's service because they're in a different town. Anybody who has New Jersey residency, I'm going to be able to serve. Our county funding, actually, interestingly enough, sometimes has to be a county resident, but that actually usually is a state person. So it roughly works out about 60 to 70% of our clients are from Plainfield. It varies a little bit based on program. Our digital literacy is a little bit less. Our ESL is a little bit more. So we probably do about, so it gets a little weird because we occasionally double count somebody in that if they take one round of digital literacy courses and then another, but we probably serve about 500 unique across all programs a year. It's usually about 50 to 60 on GED, anywhere from 2 to 250 on ESL, and then that remainder is going to be in digital literacy. And that doesn't count like the people that we don't necessarily capture very well, who are going to be your drop-ins for like, oh, I just need like a little help on my resume one day. We have actually had issues with funding streams with that because Like, for example, some of our county funding requires clients to be certified before they can receive service. And so if I have staff people manning our lab who are paid under that grant, we've had some push back and forth with them about soft touch services. It's actually something we're working on getting waivers for. So anyway.
Thanks. And what's your program, the budget for your department, your services?
So from the city, that's from, let's say I'm just gonna ballpark here. I'm probably 200,000, and then depending on the year, we're usually about another 300,000 in various contracts and grants that we bring in. So I'd say about a half a mil a year. Which works out pretty well. One of the things you also want to know, like we just got pushed back, not us, the county, but we were in their application for workforce learning link funds. They wanted us to put in, what is going to be your per head cost? Not necessarily that we're getting paid per head. You want to avoid those contracts. You always want to be on cost reimbursement if you can. But where they were putting a cap of no more than $1,500 per achieved outcome. So, you can't be in a place where, you're ending up on like a 3K per outcome or something like that, which there was some pushback from the college and some other people. You do have to have a sense of what is it you roughly need per client outcome.
And are there other adult education services in your county, adult school, community college? And if so, how do you work with them?
Oh, that's a great question. So they sort of fall into two camps, which is friends and enemies. Um, and what I mean by that is we are nonprofit, right? And there are people who are doing this for a profit, and we're going to have a hard time working with them. We even actually had that happen once where we were asked to work with an entity, and our per head cost, because we don't even really want to turn a profit, was significantly lower than what they wanted to charge because they want to make a profit. And we couldn't have these two programs charging different amounts for those sorts of things, and it kind of fell apart that way. The other thing is when you have like sort of a non-governmental entity that you're working with, and I find that there's no bad actors in this field. You really, like, nobody gets into this to make the money, but what causes problems is they want to make sure their program is distinct and has a unique identity and can be separated out because they use that to drive their fundraising, and they want to be able to say, look at me, this is why you should keep giving me money. And that makes it hard sometimes to work with them, as opposed to if you're working with another government entity where we're not as concerned about our distinct survival. We can sort of view it as how we work as a system. So generally our luck has been better with other government entities. So for example, the non-credit side of Union County College, we work with incredibly closely. They do their soft skills programming down here, which is a direct pipeline into our digital literacy stuff. We refer clients out to them after they complete our GED program. They refer clients back to us who, even they may have a GED, but like, for example, if they've been referred for what's called an industry in demand position, like phlebotomist or medical billing, they can have a high school diploma. They may even have a college degree, but they have to score a particular level of math, like say a ninth grade GLE. If they can't do that and they can't get into the program, the county college may refer them back to us. And because we're teaching math for GED, it's the same thing. And as I said, just recently, we are now part of a consortium with the county college as one of the 3 county workforce learning links. So we work really, really, really closely with them. I find they're probably our best partner in that way. We also work closely with Youth Corps, which is a county position that probably came on the chair of the county youth workforce committee. But we help them test their kids, and when their kids age out of the program, anybody that hasn't completed, the kids just stay with us because they know us. We actually worked with them for an entire summer because they had a group of kids that had aged out, and it was a whole cohort of like 12 kids who basically came to us every day, and Youth Corps would send an extra counselor down. It was a really great program in theory that we learned some lessons back at work. But in general, yeah, we work almost exclusively with other government entities, at least when it comes to anything that would be blending of programming. It just makes life a lot easier. Oh, and
Can
we
you
work
give
with Andrea all the time.
can you give an example of a for-profit service that just to clarify what that might be?
Sure. So you have private entities that do these sorts of services, and there's really two different things. So you may have something that's very like benign, like somebody started a 501c3 where they wanted to like just help people get their GEDs, and like we have one called Boxwood around here that does that, and um, they've actually donated money to us because they take in some money as that, and that's fine. But again, they're distinct. And then you would have something like we have a private English school down the street, right, where they're charging people to take English classes, and that's going to be at loggerheads with us because we never charge anyone for anything, right? So that would be what I would say would be like a sort of private entity that did it. But both are a little bit more difficult to work with than another government entity. But that would be your distinction. You still have private nonprofit and private for-profit. And I do want to be clear, private nonprofit is not necessarily always benign, okay? Um, just more likely to be so than a private entity providing those services.
Okay. Do you calculate overall cost per learner or overall cost per funder required outcome, such as certificate or degree?
Yes and no. So we know what our instructor costs are. We know what it costs to run a class, but like where that scale is interesting, right? If I have 10 people in a class or I have 11 people in a class, the cost of the class is reasonably the same minus, the textbook cost. So I have a ballpark of what it is. So for example, when I applied to our Department of Labor grant that we've been getting pretty much every year, and we got about 200,000 from them this year, they gave you a formula and they said, okay, we're willing to pay up to, it was 1,500 per outcome. And so we had to say, okay, our anticipated is this amount of digital literacy certs, this amount of GEDs, this amount of whatever, and this is how much we're asking for. And we had to make sure that that budget would fit within it. But we don't just make that up wholesale, obviously. I know how many people have in pipeline. I know what our outcomes have been in prior years. And so it's pretty easy for me to anticipate that. It does get a little wonky sometimes depending on the scope of the outcome, right? So for example, we were really happy that they accepted those North Star certs, right? And that was a big thing, Andrea. You remember this big deal that they're accepting North Stars as benchmarks, but like they're not equivalent to like when we were doing Microsoft search, which we do still do, but in much smaller numbers, or when we were doing IC3 search. So here I am reporting, oh, somebody over the course of 3 months knocked out 7 North Star certs versus, in 3 months, somebody might get a singular IC3. Or, our GED clients are going to come in and like sort of across the board. We get a lot of people who come in and they're fine on everything and maybe they just need math. And so we're going to get them through with a tutor in like 2 months. Whereas if I get somebody who comes in at like a third grade reading level, which that's about as low as we'll deal with. And if anyone has more questions on adult literacy, we can talk about. But generally, we're not going to take anybody below third or fourth grade because that's going to be a referral out to DVR or DDD. So there's not as much consistency, like where it's like you're signing up for a cruise and you know exactly how many days it's going to be. So you do have to do some math. And that's one of the reasons why you want to be on a cost reimbursement contract, not an outcome-based contract. So we have outcomes we have to meet. We have deliverables, but we want to be on cost reimbursement. So like, for example, in midst of pandemic, we were under contracts with deliverables where we had already had outlays, but obviously the pandemic gummed up the works of our client flow. We couldn't sit there and take a $20,000 loss, right, or a $25,000 loss. So we were able to still do that. Or we had a contract probably about 12 years ago, that we were dependent on our American Job Center to send us clients, and we were getting paid on a per head, and they just absolutely fell down on that. And so we were looking at being out money, because whether anybody shows up for the class or not, I still have to pay the teacher. So I really, really, really do prefer to be on expenditure reimbursement rather than per head, but you should absolutely have a sense of what that is going to cost you.
Okay, we still have a few more questions in here.
Yeah,
So,
good. I have to
can you
apologize.
share a little?
I'm on a new
Can you
medication
share?
that's drying my mouth out like crazy.
Oh, can you share a little bit more about how you work with your workforce development board?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so this is where we're going to start getting into some kind of complicated stuff. But every county should have a workforce development board, and that's supposed to be this partnership between the workforce community and the businesses in the area. But they also are going to be directing state and federal funds that come into the county to do stuff, right? And then you also have your AJC, which is your American Job Center, and there's your American Job Center operator. Now, this is going to be stuff that applies to everybody, and it's all laid out in WIOA. So it gets a little complicated, but the Workforce Development Board essentially is going to be your central point for interactions about, again, just the unemployment office, their UI insurance, employment services, American Job Center, all reports to the Workforce Development Board. And that should be the entry point into the system for people receiving workforce-related services. It isn't always, but that should be the entry point. So then we enter as a vendor to provide training services attached to that, and we get a contract from the Workforce Development Board, and it's essentially approved as a referendum. We actually normally operate under just contract with them, which is nice. We don't have to generally apply for a grant or whatever. They're just like, okay, yeah, we're a valid vendor because we're government. And so they'll just kind of go, hey, we've got $80,000 in workforce funds. Can you guys do it? We recently entered into a different partnership with them that's going to be, I think, really fascinating. So in New Jersey, the state, just across the board, the American Job Centers were doing a terrible job with their workforce learning links that were operated out of the AJCs. And so New Jersey pulled all of the money that was going directly to the AJCs for the workforce learning link and basically redistributed it via grant to pilot essentially what can we do instead of that. So the county put together a proposal for it with us and the county college and another organization called Workforce Advantage for a 2-year plan. It's a $500,000 for the county total. We get 150,000 of it to provide these workforce learning link services. And so we're going to be doing that now more in direct partnership rather than as a contracted party. And so that's pretty cool. And what that also means is we're going to be getting more access to things. So there's something called AOSOS. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that. It's America's one-stop operating system. So it's the computer system in every American Job Center. And so now, as sort of being under that umbrella, we're actually going to have access to that, which should make some client stuff much easier to do. I actually have to provide some information to get into that. That's a thing on my to-do list. So we're really happy about that. And the other thing is your Workforce Development Board is going to have a plan that they're going to put out every couple of years. And so we've been a named partner in that plan, which is good. So that also got us information sharing stuff. But yeah, you definitely want to be showing up there a lot. They're going to be the flow of your workforce funds at the county level. I don't know. I feel like I was a little circling the mark on that one, but
Um, couple other questions. And so one I can also speak to a little bit, and one I think you'd be very excited to answer.
Okay.
So the one that I can speak to a little bit, so how many other public libraries in New Jersey have followed the Plainfield model? So that is kind of what we were trying to do with NJSL Plus Partners with our ARPA funding. But unfortunately, because that was not permanent funding, it started and then was finished over that year. There are libraries, certainly Plainfield has worked with libraries and shared the model. And there's also the Labor and Literacy Library Program, where libraries, rather than having funding to implement this, they're voluntarily taking elements of that program. And the way that Plainfield does runs things, and they're able to get consulting services, kind of, answer questions, get some resources and things like that. But without funding going to those libraries to fund staff or admin overhead or anything like that. But I'll let Scott speak to that, as well as the other question about do you work with programs that use volunteer tutors or AmeriCorps? And if you want to talk about how you work with volunteers as well.
So yeah, as far as how well we've done at distribution, there's a couple like Atlantic City, I think does a pretty solid job. There's a couple more where we've got involvement in the workforce system, but no, I don't think there's anybody that's doing, $250,000, or whatever we're doing a year with that. I will say we have a lot of interest in it. Generally, people become significantly more positive about the idea that this may be a good way to bring in funding. It's a surprisingly more distinct at a local level issue than I think we had initially anticipated. The amount of factors in terms of the size and resources of the building, the transportation systems around it. And I think the human capital required even to get the ball rolling has been a little difficult. So I have not given up, and I think that these people are very generally supportive. So we're gonna see how that goes. As far as volunteers, so we actually work with AmeriCorps seniors as part of the program we're doing with Andrea, and that's been going really, really well for recruiting people. And we've been recruiting and training them and placing them in libraries to do ESL, GED, and some digital literacy navigation. I will say, not to work in broad strokes, but working with AmeriCorps seniors might not necessarily give us a high success rate on finding digital navigators. But generally, that's been really, really, really good. We work a decent amount with volunteers. We started out as a volunteer-based program. I still have about 30 volunteers, but I am going to just say this. It's a great way to build a service. It's a great way to supplement a service. But for example, our digital literacy program is all paid instructors. We've moved our ESL program to our beginner level, or what we call our level ones. These are people who are scoring so low they can't be tamed. That's all by paid instructor. I have three paid instructors. And then they train our volunteers, and when they finish a group who now has somewhat of a functional level of English, I mean, functional, they then get moved to working in smaller groups with those volunteers. I don't want to knock volunteers. I think that, they're all really good people, but when I look at the amount of man hours that's required to manage volunteers for the outcomes that you're likely to get, they tend to not necessarily work well with large groups. I mean, I've had, outliers where, you get somebody who's a retired teacher for, 25 years who basically is as much as a paid staffer as you're going to get. But the sort of one-to-one model that a lot of the volunteers like, we basically have tried to get rid of that for a couple of reasons. one, adult ed is sort of famous for retention being bad, and not just retention, attendance. And, you know, if I have a volunteer who has one student they work with and that student cancels 3 times, and I'm not in the loop about it, then they're showing up, nobody's there. It makes it hard to keep them. If I'm at least working in a group of a decent size, you know, I've got 5, I've got 6, maybe 2 people don't show up, maybe 3 people, but the plane still flies. People don't feel as whatever. The other problem is, if it's not a job, you do have issues with consistency. Like, we've done programs, we've worked with colleges before. Kane University used to send us people from their master's in ed program. They'd get some credit for teaching this, but they'd reset every 3 months, right? That was difficult. We've had Union County College used to send us people from their student ambassador program, but they'd keep resetting. And so, not just is that not good in terms of the clients they're working with distinctly, you can't create a consistency of program either, right? Because it does take time to train staff. So I think the volunteers work really well in limited application, but obviously if you don't have any other option, yeah, absolutely. And we do have a book that we put together for state library on how to train your volunteers, and I can get that file out to people if they want it. It's set up to be about like a 3-day workshop on the basics of how to teach anything. I really like it, but I am probably very biased because, you know, but I'd be more than happy to share that. I think it was original working title was Care and Feeding of Your Volunteers, but they told me that was being too cute. It's a problem I have often. Anyway, sorry, do we have other questions?
I think we're probably we don't have any more questions in the chat, and I think it's probably time to wrap it up. But Scott, you were just a wealth of knowledge and information as always. So thank you very much.
No problem. And I absolutely mean it. My contact stuff is up there. Please, please, please reach out to me. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now.